Sorry for that, not unmuting myself. So looks like we have a good number of people who have joined. We've just been waiting to give people a chance to get in. It looks like people are still popping in, but kind of slowly. So maybe we should go ahead and get started because it's just a 2 or 3 minutes after time now. So welcome everybody to the seminar today. We're very pleased to have Dr. Morey here, who's going to be giving a talk today. And also thank you to Dr. DeCastro, who's going to be introducing her. He's from the School of Nursing, so we're pleased to have both of them. So a couple of housekeeping things that I'll mention. So we've been having everyone use the Q&A and not the chat. So it seems like that's working pretty well. So go ahead as you think of questions and put them in the Q&A. If it's more clarification type of question, then we'll try to answer that. I'll try to help with doing that and doing it along the way. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end and we'll manage questions. But what I can do, if everyone's okay with it, is unmute you so you can go ahead and read your own question. And it's kind of nice to have more of a discussion that way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. DeCastro. Thank you again.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Brittany Morey. Dr. Morey is an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Society, and Behavior at the University of California, Irvine's Program of Public Health. Dr. Morey's research focuses on how structural racism shapes racial and ethnic health disparities. Specifically, this work examines how neighborhood, social, and physical environments contribute to health disparities, especially for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. She received her PhD in 2017 and a Master of Public Health degree in 2011, both in Community Health Sciences from the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And from 2017 to 2019, she was a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of California, Riverside. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Morey.
Thank you so much, Butch. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So thank you everyone for being here today. Of course, I would have much preferred for us to all be in person and to have that more face-to-face interaction, but as is with most things these days, I'm really trying to look on for the silver lining and everything. And so, we had originally tried to have this talk at an earlier time last year, but that didn't work out. But I think one of the fortuitous things about me giving this talk today is really that that with the timing of it, with the election right around the corner, and immigration policy being one of the major things that is on the ballot this year, that for this group especially, that is people who are interested in demography, that it's important for us to think about how these immigration policies, and in particular more restrictive immigration policies, shape who ends up being able to come to the United States as an immigrant, how it shapes the process of people who want to come to the United States. And what are the implications then in this study for health? So thank you again for having me here. So today I'm going to be sharing some work that was recently published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior just this past September that looks at the role of immigrant visas, which are created by immigration policies, and the role that they play in the phenomenon of migrant health selection. So I'd like to also recognize my collaborators and co-authors on this work, Adrienne Bekong and Anna Hing, two amazing collaborators at UCLA. Butch DeCastro, thank you so much for that introduction, who is also a co-author on this work, and Dr. Gilbert G, who is also at UCLA. It's often noted that there is this immigrant health advantage. And in the United States context, that often looks like immigrants in the US reporting better health than their non-immigrant counterparts, even of the same race and ethnicity. And one of the common explanations for this is that of migrant health selection. And that's this kind of broad idea that only the healthiest and wealthiest are able to make the journey and to come to the United States and to arrive successfully as migrants. Now, on the surface, this seems like a pretty simple explanation, but I want to challenge us to think a little bit deeper about what this migrant health selection actually means in today's contexts. So let's think about, way back in the day, where in order to migrate to the United States, let's say from a place like Asia, you might have had to board a ship, travel for a month or longer, and make this arduous, long journey. And so in that case, it might make sense that only the hardiest people, the healthiest people would actually be able to survive that journey and to come and arrive as migrants. But today, of course, that's not the case. It's fairly easy for us to buy a plane ticket, to hop in a plane, and to get to a foreign destination in the matter of 24 hours. So it's not exactly that journey that is, the first step of that journey of going to another place that is selecting people on their health necessarily. It's all the things that build up prior to that time, prior to people actually taking that first step in their physical journey. So we might think about people having certain characteristics that make them more adventurous or more apt to want to migrate or more able to migrate. We also might want to think about people's personal circumstances, their life chances, where they were born, what kind of family they were born into, and how these things can shape whether people even consider migration in the first place and whether they can successfully achieve migration in the end. And then importantly, I also want us to think about the way that immigration policies set the requirements and the process by which people apply to become migrants. And it sets the bar, the standards by which people can qualify. And so US immigration policies can actually stretch back and affect people in other foreign countries and affect who is able to be selected to be a migrant even prior to them arriving on US soil. So how have other studies tried to get at this migrant health selection? So with everything that I just mentioned, it's actually a much more complicated thing to study than we might think. So Kresh and Frank studied this by looking at recent immigrants in the United States and comparing them to the population in the countries of origin. And indeed, they found that migrant health selection was occurring, but it really varied. It wasn't across the board that all people were getting selected on health. Socioeconomic status of those new immigrants did explain some of migrant health selection, but they also had this interesting finding, which is that people who were immigrating on family-based visas were experiencing lower levels or non-existent health selection compared to other immigrants. Hamilton, Palermo, and Green looked at recent cohorts of Latinx immigrants in the United States and compared them to cohorts of immigrants that had arrived at earlier times. And they found that the more recent immigrants cohorts, that they were experiencing higher levels of health selection than the previous cohorts before them. So they were healthier upon arrival than those previous cohorts. And the explanation that they give is that over time, immigration policy has become more and more restrictive. And those restrictions have caused greater health selectivity in these more recent cohorts of immigrants. Now, Rowe, Fleischer, and Blebu, they do something similar to Kresh and Frank, where they look at recent immigrants in the United States and they compare them to the populations in the countries of origin. And they did a country level analysis to see what predicts migrant health selection from various countries. Interestingly, they found that the economic contexts in those countries and also the health status of people within those countries was not at all a strong predictor of whether migrant health selection was occurring. Rather, one of the strong predictors of selection was the visa makeup of people from those countries, such that countries that were more likely to send migrants who were on family-based visas were experiencing lower levels of health selection, or again, non-existent health selection. So these studies are getting us to start to think about how migrant visas might play a role in migrant health selection, and also show how immigration policies can have an effect on health selection. But there is some limitations to these studies as well, which is that they are studying newly arrived immigrants in the United States and comparing them to a population in the country of origin. Now, these two groups may not necessarily be comparable. And also, we are possibly conflating migrant health selection, the process that occurs prior to migration, with the fact that they are already here, they're already immigrants in the United States. Now, there is one study that examines pre-migration health and can compare pre-migration health to post-migration health, and that is the Mexican Family Life Survey. So Rubalcaba et al. Look at the Mexican Family Life Survey, and they found that in the Mexico to US context, that there's actually very little evidence of health selection occurring. And some suggest that this might be because of the lower costs of migration coming from Mexico to the United States because of the close proximity. So we have these weaknesses with being able to find the right comparison group, with studying a process that starts before migration, and the fact that we have often only studied this in the context of the Mexico-US immigration context. So our study seeks to address some of these gaps, and we do so looking at the Philippine-U.S. migration context. So let me give some background. The Philippine population in the United States is the largest population of Filipinos outside of the Philippines. And Filipinos in the United States make up the third fastest growing immigrant group, right behind Chinese and Asian Indian immigrants. Now, there's been a long history between the Philippines and the United States that involves colonization for many centuries, that involves militarization with US taking over Spanish military bases in the Philippines, that have affected these flows of migration to the United States. And after the Immigration Act of 1965, Filipinos started arriving in even more numbers. So what are the main routes of immigration from the Philippines to the United States? Well, the first thing that you might think of is employment. I think a lot of us assume that people are coming to the United States to work. And indeed, there's been a long history of people coming from the Philippines to the United States to work as laborers, to work in agriculture and other industries. And another major venue is through healthcare. So because of the US influence on the educational system in the Philippines, people who are educated in healthcare are educated much in the same way as they are here. But low wages in the Philippines, combined with things like nursing shortages elsewhere and a demand for healthcare workers, has meant that many Filipinos have come to the United States to work in occupations such as nursing and other allied healthcare fields. So that's one way of immigration, through employment. Another way is through family reunification. And this is what the current presidential administration might label in a derogatory sense as chain migration, but really this is family reunification migrants. These are people who have US citizen relatives or relatives that are already in the United States who can petition on their behalf to come to the United States. And I'll go into this a little bit more later, but there are different levels of family reunification migrants with different processes to qualify and different lengths of time that it takes to actually qualify for these types of visas. Now, there's a subset of family reunification visas that's common in the Philippine-U.S. migration context that I want to highlight, that's not often thought of or talked about, which is that of people who are in the Philippines who are moving to the United States in order to marry a US citizen. So these are fiancé or marriage migrants. Now, because of the US military bases in the Philippines, there's been a history of US servicemen in relationships, intimate relationships with Filipino women. There's also been a history of things like mail order bride services for US-based men seeking to marry Asian or Filipino women. And although these services may not exist in the same form that they did in the past, they still continue through things like dating websites where people can easily meet and start a relationship with a Filipino person. So that's some of the context. Let's now think about these different visa types and how it relates to health selection. So first, let's take family reunification visas. Like I mentioned before, there's different levels of these types of visas. They could be numerically unlimited. That means that there's no cap on the number of people who can qualify for these types of visas. These are the closest relationships to a US citizen, such as the parent of a US citizen or the child of a US citizen who is not currently married. So these types of visas take a shorter amount of time to get processed and represent a closer relationship to a US citizen. Whereas there's also numerically limited family reunification visas, and these have strict caps on the number of people who are allowed in per year by the US State Department. And these include people such as the children of US citizens who are now adults who have children of their own. It also includes relatives of people in the United States who are legal permanent residents. And so there are different categories and prioritization levels for these numerically limited family reunification visa holders. So we can think about the different sources of capital that these people need to have. And their main source of being able to migrate is that close relationship to a US-based person. Now let's take fiancé or marriage visa holders. These types of visas are considered conditional. And that means that after they move to the United States, they have to get married and prove that their marriage happened in order to have this conditional status removed. However, these visas are also numerically unlimited, meaning there's no cap on the number of US citizens who can petition for their foreign-born fiancé to move to the United States. So if you think about the types of resources or personal characteristics that fiancé or marriage migrants need to have, we might think of something like English language proficiency, where in order to meet, to communicate with their potential spouse, that they need to have fairly good English language proficiency. So that might be one characteristic that allows people to be in this category eventually. Now let's take employment visas. Employment visas require an employer or an agent-based sponsor in the United States. And it also includes the spouses and the children of these employees, these workers. So employment visas, we think that people probably need to have a special skill set or a certain level of education, right, in order to qualify for employment visas. And these things like education are the same things that are also related to health. So we can think about how employment visa holders might be selected on their health differently than these other visa categories. So all of these observations inform our research aims for this study. Our first goal was to categorize and to compare visa types among lawful Filipino migrants. Our second aim was to determine if there is indeed a health advantage of migrants over non-migrants prior to immigration into the United States. So this is key, it's prior to immigration. And we're looking here to see if health selectivity is happening prior to immigration. And our third aim is to calculate differences among the migrants by visa type. A sub-aim of aims 2 and 3 is to look at whether personal characteristics or resources of these migrants account for these differences in health. So in order to get at these unique aims, we use a very groundbreaking and powerful data set called the Health of Philippine Immigrant Study, or HOPE study. And I truly credit Dr. Butch DeCastro and Dr. Gilbert G for creating this sample, and this study, which is still ongoing. It's longitudinal, so it's still ongoing currently. So what's unique about this is that they use population sampling to look at pre-migration health so that they can then compare with this sample over time and look at post-migration health as well. And the way that they get at a population-based sample of migrants is because in the Philippines, the migration route has been so well established that in order for people to take that final administrative step to get a stamp on their passport in order to board an airplane and migrate, they need to attend what's called this pre-departure orientation seminar that's put on by the Philippine government. And so they sampled at these PDOS seminars. So this is capturing the population at the time of people who are intending to migrate to the United States and capture their pre-migration health literally days or weeks before they are about to leave the Philippines. Now, not only do we have this population-based sample of migrants, but we also have a population-based sample of non-migrants. And these are people who were collected, whose data were collected via stratified random sampling. They were collected to match the migrant population roughly based on age, gender, and education. So now we have a sample of 832 Filipinos who are about to migrate to the United States and 805 Filipinos who are remaining in the Philippines, who are comparable, except for the fact that one group is migrating and another is not, for a total sample of 1,637 respondents. So the main dependent variable that we're looking at here is the number of health conditions. So this is the list of the 10 different health conditions that we looked at, and people reported if they had any lifetime experience of any of these conditions. And we created a sum to create our dependent variable. Our independent variable of interest is visa type. And so here we're able to look at non-migrants and compare them to folks who have numerically limited family reunification visas, to people with numerically unlimited family reunification visas, to fiancé or marriage visa holders, and to employment visa holders. The covariates that we were interested in included personal characteristics as well as personal resources. So the personal characteristics were age, gender, region in the Philippines, healthcare access, and English proficiency. And then for personal resources, we're looking at educational attainment and financial strain. So for our first analysis in AIM 1, we combined respondents' data on their visa codes that they provided. And we combined that with data taken from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, and the U.S. Department of State to describe these visas in detail based on whether it was a principal or derivative. So that means the principal person applying for the visa, such as an employment visa, or a derivative, which is a person whose visa depends on that principal. So for example, the spouse of that employment visa holder. We also describe them in terms of whether an affidavit of support was needed. So this is a legal document that says that a US based person is going to support that immigrant once they arrive in the United States. We also describe visas in terms of whether they were numerically limited or unlimited by the US government. And we also created a measure of the estimated amount of time it took for each visa type to be processed. So this is the estimated amount of time from when they first submitted their visa to when it was finally approved by the US government. For AIMS 2 and 3, we used Poisson regression, which we conducted in Stata version 15. So now let me give you an overview of the different visa categories in the HOPES dataset. So for limited family reunification visa holders, these are numerically limited, so their numbers are capped by the US government. An affidavit of support is needed for all of these immigrants. And they made up about 44% of the total HOPES migrant sample. Now I want to bring your attention to the visa processing time for this group, which was higher than any of the other groups in this sample. So the amount of time it took for limited family reunification visa holders for their visas to be processed ranged anywhere from 2 to 24 years, with a median of about 10 to 15 years. So imagine you're applying to join your family in the United States and then proceed to wait for 10 years, up to 2 decades, even longer, for your visa to finally get approved. When we looked at these numbers, we thought that this is actually quite stunning to think about. Now compare that with unlimited family reunification visa holders. These are closer relationships to a US citizen. They are not subject to numerical limitations. They only sometimes need an affidavit of support, and 21% of our sample fell in this group. And these visas were processed right away, so within weeks. And so we put the visa processing time as 0 years here. Now for fiancé or marriage migrants, these are also numerically unlimited. And 232 of the migrants, or over a quarter of the migrants, fell into this fiancé or marriage migrant category. And again, these visas were processed right away. And the last group is employment visas, and these do have numerical limitations on them. And surprisingly, only 62 migrants, or 7% of our sample, fell into this employment migrant category. And these visas took anywhere between 0 and 5 years to be processed. Now let's get into some of the descriptive results for the HOPES survey respondents. So here we can look at the total sample. We can also compare the sample by whether they are non-migrants or whether they are migrants. And for the migrants, we can compare them by visa category, so limited family, unlimited family reunification, fiancé marriage, or employment visas. So let me walk you through this, pointing out these selected descriptive statistics. So first, if we look at age, the average age in the sample was 37, but this varied by visa type. Unlimited family reunification visa holders were older on average, and we think that this might reflect the fact that these are parents, it consists of a larger number of parents of US citizens. On the other hand, fiancé or marriage migrants had lower age on average. Their average age was 32 years old. Now let's look at the gender breakdown. Overall, there were more females in the sample than males, but this really again varied by visa type. Limited family reunification and employment visa holders, they were about equally split between male and female. But if we look at fiancé or marriage migrants, a whopping 93% identified as female. So we can see here that the majority of people in this category are Filipino women who are moving to the United States to marry a US citizen. If we look at English speaking proficiency, it should be unsurprising that migrants have higher English speaking proficiency than non-migrants. But by far the highest levels of English proficiency were seen among the fiancé marriage migrants and also among the employment migrants. Now let's look at some of the socioeconomic characteristics. So migrants in general were more college educated than non-migrants. But if we look at unlimited family reunification migrants, they had the similar levels of education as non-migrants. Whereas for employment migrants, 95% had a college degree. So we can see here that there are different resources needed, right, to qualify for these different types of visas. Now let's look at financial strain. Again, we see the common finding that migrants had lower levels of financial strain than non-migrants, so they were better off. And this was especially pronounced again by the employment visa category. Now let's look at the number of health conditions. So migrants overall reported a lower number of health conditions on average than non-migrants. In other words, they were healthier than non-migrants. But again, this varied by visa type. If we look at the limited family reunification visas, again, these are the visa types that took the longest to be processed, they were reporting a higher number of health conditions than even non-migrants. Whereas for fiancé or marriage migrants, they were by far reporting the lowest number of health conditions compared to any of the other groups. Now here we get into some of the Poisson regression results, and this shows the number of health conditions by migrant status as the main independent variable here. And I don't show all the covariates here, but basically Model 2 accounts for all those personal characteristics like age and gender, whereas Model 3 accounts for the socioeconomic characteristics, educational attainment, and financial strain. And we can see that across the models, migrants are reporting a lower number of health conditions compared to non-migrants. In other words, they are healthier than non-migrants, even after accounting for personal characteristics and personal resources. However, if we now break down the migrant group by their various visa types, a much more complex and nuanced story emerges. So let's first look at the limited family reunification migrants in Model 1. So this is just looking at the bivariate associations. And we see here that they are still reporting a significantly higher number of health conditions. They are less healthy than non-migrants in this Model 1. Now, this association doesn't persist after accounting for personal characteristics and accounting for socioeconomic characteristics. Now let's take unlimited family reunification migrants. At first, they did not seem to have different levels of health compared to non-migrants. But after accounting for personal characteristics and personal resources, they were actually reporting a lower number of health conditions than non-migrants. So there might be some effect here of being in this visa category on better health. Now, surprisingly, for this fiancé marriage migrant group, they were the group that were experiencing the lowest number of health conditions, not only compared to non-migrants, but even compared to all the other migrant categories. And this trend persisted even after accounting for personal characteristics and personal resources. Now, for employment visa holders, we did not see any significant associations, but you can look at these coefficients here and see that after controlling for the covariates, that they might have some level of a health advantage compared to non-migrants. The coefficients are negative, so a lower number of health conditions. But perhaps due to the small sample size in our employment category, we were not powered enough to show that these findings were statistically significant. Now, this is a graphical representation of what we just showed. So this is the health conditions by visa type, predicted after accounting for all of the covariates. So again, we see that non-migrants and limited family reunification migrants have similar levels of health conditions. unlimited and employment visa holders might have slightly better, lower number of health conditions, although the 95% confidence intervals indicate that this isn't statistically significant. And by far the healthiest group are the fiancé or marriage migrants. Now, we conducted a supplemental analysis in which we looked in the migrant sample only, and we wanted to see whether the time it took for people's visas to be processed had an effect on health. And we did indeed find this significant positive association, even after accounting for all the covariates, such that the longer time it took for people's visas to be processed, the higher number of health conditions they were reporting. So this analysis should be taken with a grain of salt. An estimate of visa processing time is indeed just that, it's just an estimate. But I think that these findings are very interesting and might inform studies moving forward. So let me summarize the main findings for us. So indeed, we found that migrants overall reported better health compared to non-migrants. So it does seem to be that there's some health selection happening. And again, this is prior to the migrant sample actually stepping foot on the airplane to come to the United States. We also found that migrants had more socioeconomic resources than non-migrants. But when we looked at the specific visa type, the fiancé marriage category was indeed the only visa category with strong health selection. On the other hand, we didn't find strong evidence of health selection occurring for numerically unlimited family reunification and employment migrants. And this seems to reflect some of the prior literature that I mentioned earlier that found that family-based visa holders were experiencing lower levels of health selection or non-existent health selection. We also had this interesting finding that numerically limited family reunification migrants reported worse health than non-migrants, despite having higher education and lower financial strain. And so we want to suggest that this might have to do with exposure to visa stress. And visa stress is basically this idea that as people are in this legal limbo and applying for a visa, that they're experiencing stress. And because numerically limited family reunification migrants are waiting for a longer time for their visas to be processed, they might be exposed to this stress for a longer period of time. And that might be indeed what's explaining the fact that they have worse health. And Yasso in her work really expounds upon this idea of visa stress. So I encourage you to look into her work for more details on this concept. Of course, our study has limitations that should be noted. We have a relatively, there's a low response rate for migrants. 36.5% of potential migrants responded to the HOPE survey. Of course, this reflects the very busy lives of migrants prior to immigration. And I will also notice that this response rate is comparable to other population-based studies. We can't rule out the possibility that there is some selection bias, that the people who decided to opt into the study were perhaps healthier than people who opted not to be part of the study. There is also the possibility that migrants could be undercounting their health conditions. So there's some reporting bias going on here. Maybe they feel healthier simply for the fact that they qualified to immigrate to the United States, or perhaps they are undercounting their health conditions because they don't want their responses in the survey to jeopardize their immigration. So yeah, so that even though they were assured that that would not be the case, that might still be happening. Also, the HOPES data set does not include all the possible visa types that the United States has. For example, it doesn't include refugees. It doesn't include people who come to the United States on diversity visas. It also doesn't include people who end up being undocumented in the United States. So this could be people who come to the United States on travel visas, but then end up overstaying their travel visa. So to conclude, our study finds that immigrant visas are indeed a socio-political construct that works to shape health selectivity, the process of health selectivity, and ends up shaping who is able to come to the United States. We also find that restrictive immigration policies may affect visa processing times, and that these restrictive immigration policies, therefore, may be contributing to migrant health selectivity, such that more restrictive policies could be extending wait times for potential migrants and could be potentially dampening any health selectivity at the very least, or even worsening health among those potential migrants. And so I want to give this analogy, which I'm happy to get some feedback on in the Q&A, of an anthill. And if we imagine that migrants are like ants in this anthill, and to emerge from the top is to successfully migrate, we might think that these migrants might have some personal characteristics or life chances that allow them to navigate through this maze more easily than other people. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to think about the sediment, the rocks, the dirt, the things that are surrounding them that people are trying to navigate through in this analogy that can make the pathway easier for certain people to go through. It could create roadblocks and boulders for other people that stops them from being able to complete this process in the first place. And so that working through and the changing context of immigration policy can really affect who ends up successfully migrating and can affect the health of those people who are working their way through this maze. So what are the next steps for this work? Of course, a natural extension of this work is to examine whether there is heterogeneity in health trajectories by visa type after migration. And also, I'm interested to see whether these initial health advantages, especially among the fiancé or marriage visa holders, if these advantages decline with time in the United States. I'm also interested in asking whether the parents' visa types affect the health of the children in the second generation born in the United States. And of course, I think it's important for us to think about how these findings might generalize to other countries, not only other countries that are sending immigrants to the United States, but also other countries' immigration policy contexts who are receiving immigrants. And how do those policy contexts affect the health of people who are coming to migrate? So I just want to thank you all again for allowing me to be here and speak to you today. I want to recognize my co-authors, also our funders for this work, and the partners who really made this research happen. So salamat, thank you very much. So I believe now we're going to have some time for Q&A. I have if you have questions, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'm looking right now, it doesn't look like anyone has posted any questions as of yet.
I am not actually able to put any questions in the Q&A, but I could start with a couple of things I was thinking about while you were talking. So it sounds like there's another group where maybe they've put in an application, they're trying to migrate, but they're not successful. Would that inform some of your questions about whether there's maybe a stress mechanism at play in trying to get the visa, and it's that group that has poor health? And could that be factored in, and how might that work or not be helpful? I'm wondering.
Right, yeah, so that is a very interesting question. Like, what about the health of those people who are attempting to migrate, who end up not being able to, or who are still in limbo and are experiencing visa stress? So we don't have data on that in the HOPE study, but I think that is a really interesting thing to think about, is what is affecting the health of people who are trying to migrate or who ran into a roadblock and ended up having their visas denied. There's been no research to my knowledge that's been done on the health of those people and how their health is affected by the fact that they've tried to immigrate and haven't been able to. But I would imagine that this study, if it's any indication, that this process, a stressful process, could be detrimental to health. And so we do also need to think about, I think when we're thinking about immigration policy in particular, the ethical implications of making policies more restrictive, the effect that this has on people in other countries who want to migrate for various reasons. All right, so an anonymous attendee asked this question. I would normally maybe ask you to, if you wanted to unmute yourself to ask the question, but I think maybe because they're anonymous, I'll just repeat this question here. So one person said, curious about what other possible explanations beyond visa stress for lower health among migrants. Could more health issues drive migration, such as older sick parent wanting to reunite with their children in the States? Yeah, so I think if I'm understanding this question, I think that there could be other factors that contribute to lower levels of health, for example, among um, the limited family reunification folks. Perhaps it could be, older parents wanting to reunite with their children in the United States. But when we did look at visa processing time, which isn't a direct measure of visa stress, but visa processing time in relationship to health among migrants, we did find that there was an association even after accounting for age. So it might not necessarily be age, but it could be that people applying for certain visas are sicker than other folks, and that might be driving lower health among certain groups as well. Okay, so another person asked, how do you parse out health issues from visa stress versus the natural progression of health problems due to environmental factors beyond this form of stress that arise due to age? Okay, so I kind of answered that a little bit in this last question, that even after controlling for age, that the time it took for visas to be processed was associated. But again, we don't have a direct measure of visa stress in our study. The younger population seems to be healthier and the older population has increased health problems. Couldn't you attribute this to the predictable aging process? So in our study, we did account for age. And again, for the groups that we did still find a positive health selection effect for, the fiancé migrants, even after accounting for age, there was still a positive health selection. And for the other groups, we saw a less degree of health selection happening. So yeah, so we did account for age in our models. So we have another question from Kimia Imani. Kimia, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question live?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. I think you already touched on this as well, but I was just wondering how this data could relate to the younger population in terms of youth and adolescents migrating to the U.S.
Right, so our analysis only included adult migrants. So that is a good point, that it didn't include young children, people under the age of, I think, 17 or 18. And so that is another question that I think would be interesting to explore in the future, is how have youth and adolescents' health, how has their health been shaped by this process of immigration? And I think in most cases, those youth and adolescents, their visa status would be really dependent on their parents' legal status, right? And so, and whether or not they are migrating with their parent or not at that time. And so I think those are all good questions to pursue in future work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question from Anisha. Anisha, would you like to ask it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just wondering if you've looked at where migrants end up in the United States, if that has any impact on their health outcomes too. So if you're like in an urban setting where there's more health services in general versus more rural settings, things like that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So this initial study really looked at the pre-migration health. So we didn't look at post-migration health, but we do have data on that now that these HOPES participants have been followed up on. And that's actually a really important question that I'm very interested in pursuing in the future, especially because I do neighborhood research, research on how neighborhood environments affect people's health. So I think that's a very important question to ask, is now that these HOPES migrants are in the United States, how does the context in which they live in the United States affect their health over time? And of course, we know that migrants are also more mobile within the United States than non-migrants. And so our initial kind of look at where people are moving to once they move to the United States, it really varies. So you see that people maybe initially move to the coasts, but then over time, they're going to the more inland places. And so it would be a really interesting question that I'm interested in pursuing about where people are moving and how this influences their health trajectory.
Cool, thank you. That'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, but feel free to post if there are any more. Okay, so
Oh, I was going to ask one more simple question.
okay.
Why does it take so long? And is there anything systematic about that that could be coded to learn about what's going on with certain people? Do they have more difficult cases that are being reviewed, for example?
Yeah, so for the people whose visas are taking the longest, those are the limited family reunification folks. It's really more of a kind of administrative backlog problem, I believe. So because the United States has caps, like strict caps on the number of people who are allowed in each visa category per year, people are waiting in a queue for their time to come to be admitted to this type of visa category, because only a certain number from around the world are allowed in this particular category per year. So they're literally waiting in a queue, and it could take, depending on which type of family member you are, it could take a shorter time or it could take a really long time because there's a lot of people in that queue, and the United States has a strict cap on those numbers. So that's really, I think, the reason why certain visas are taking so long to get processed. It's not that someone's sitting on it on their desk for 20 years. I think it's more of these policies and these caps. Okay, so David has a question. Do you want to ask your question by unmuting yourself?
Here I am. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for your presentation. It was very nice presentation, very systematic and thorough. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My general question is, your study is examining people from the Philippines who are migrating to the United States. And so do people from the Philippines also migrate to other countries? And so what proportion of all migrants, are coming to the United States? That's my general question.
Yes, so the Philippines has migrants that go to many other countries in the world, including other Asian countries, including countries in Europe and in the Middle East. There are a lot of receiving countries for Filipino migrants, actually. I don't know the exact proportions off the top of my head. The United States is a major destination, of course, because of the long history there with the United States and the military presence in the Philippines. So yes, I don't know, maybe Butch knows off the top of your head, but I don't know the exact percentage that end up going to the US versus other countries.
Yeah, I cannot add to that either. I don't have those percentages, Dave. So great question, but just a side comment. It'd be great if we could do a multi-country longitudinal study to compare where people are going and looking at health status as that transition happens to other parts of the world. But yeah, that is a bigger endeavor.
Yes, there could be that other countries are getting healthier people than the United States.
Yeah.
Or less healthy people, depending on how it goes.
Yeah.
They're good points.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Okay, so there's another last question here by Maria. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask it?
Sure. Hi. This was really interesting. Thank you very much. And yeah, so I was wondering if you have data on which type of health conditions you saw, whether there was a pattern across these different visa types. And since I'm already asking, I was wondering too, if you could sort of if you had the information, what would you anticipate undocumented migrants and refugees and diversity visas? What would they look like, do you think?
Right. So thank you for your question. So let's tackle the first part, which is the different types of health conditions that people might have. We haven't looked into that in particular, but that would be a really interesting question to look at is, do people who do report health conditions, are there differences there in the type of health conditions that people are reporting? We were just kind of looking at global health by creating a sum. But yeah, that would be interesting to try to parse apart. You will notice that on average, migrants do report a fairly low number of health conditions, but at the same time, it would still be interesting to see what exactly those health conditions were. And then the second question was about how this might apply to people who are undocumented in the United States, people on refugee visas. So my personal thoughts on this is that, the more difficult it becomes, I think our U.S. immigration policy context is becoming more and more challenging for people to navigate. And I think that ends up pushing people who would normally want to legally migrate to the United States into these routes where they end up migrating in other means besides the legal way. And so if we think about the people who are being pushed out into those other categories, it could be that they are more healthy than others from their home country because they are the ones that are able to maybe navigate it. But I think it's also the fact that they have to go through so much. If you think about refugees, if you think about people who arrive undocumented, that process of going through all that and living in the United States and coming to the United States as undocumented, I imagine that would be a very stressful and difficult process that might actually cause health selection not to occur at all, or might cause worse health. So that's my personal thought. I think there's studies that show that, for example, Latinx immigrants have better health than U.S. born, but I think that doesn't really get at this health selection issue. And I think that people assume that it's just a Hispanic health paradox where they're healthier, and that's because of migrant health selection. But I just don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that there are more stressors than not that can actually negatively impact health.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that was the last. Oh, okay. So there's another question from Aja Sutton.
Yeah, Asia.
Sorry.
So,
Asia,
no, it's fine. So I've done a little bit of reading about stepwise international migration, and I know that the Philippine population participates in this kind of migration fairly frequently in terms of employment visas. And so I understand that sometimes people will have multiple employment visas over time. And I was wondering if you have considered that, or if you want to consider that in the future, and if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a really good point, that people might have different types of employment visas or change different visa types over time. So yeah, that's something that we haven't looked at in this study yet, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at in the future. Yeah, especially in the Philippine context, if people are maybe being sponsored by one employer and then switch to another, and what that looks like. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have one more question. I hope it's okay. I jumped in. I don't know much about immigration policy. I should, but I'm wondering, within each of those visa types, are there quotas for where people can come from within each visa type, like for the employment visa type or the fiance visa type, like only certain numbers from this part of the world versus this part of the world? Or is it just a queue? Do you know?
That's a really good question. I think that there definitely are limitations on the type. And I believe that for certain visa types, there are also quotas from the nation. So I know, for example, I believe for refugees that there are some limitations. Of course, we saw the president several years ago, 4 years ago now, seems like forever ago, ban people from certain countries, and the U.S. has had a history of doing so. And so, I think that whether it plays out deliberately, where there are deliberate visa restrictions on people from certain countries, or whether it ends up playing out that way just because people end up not being able to qualify if they are from a certain country, I think there are country-based limitations to qualifying for visas.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, thanks again, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Morey. That was wonderful. We really appreciate your time. And for students, as a reminder, in the chat, there's a link to continue talking with Dr. Morey. So from 1:30 to 2:15, more discussion for graduate students. So go ahead and just use the link in the chat to go there at 1:30. Okay, well, super. Thank you so much. So a little break in between, but thank you again. And to Dr. DeCastro, we appreciate it.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Butch. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.